It's genuinely sobering when you think about it, how decisions made, decades ago are still casting these really long shadows, impacting everything today.
Absolutely. And we're about to take a deep dive into a really pivotal time, those years right after the Cold War ended. Looking at that often tense relationship between the West and Russia.
Right. And for this, we're looking at the series you sent over. They give a pretty critical look at this period.
We'll be focusing pretty tightly on NATO expansion and those key decisions that, well, many argue kind of set the stage for the terrible situation we see now in Ukraine.
Exactly. These sources are excerpts from a quite a detailed analysis looking at the roots of this new Cold War.
Yeah. Our aim isn't to just overwhelm you with every single detail, right?
No, not at all. We want to pull out the crucial bits, those surprising facts maybe, or the key perspectives that really show how we got here.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Starting with that promise, the one that's been at the heart of so much argument. The idea that NATO wouldn't expand eastward.
A really big one.
And what's so important is the context, right? German reunification. The Soviet Union allows this huge thing to happen
Monumental.
based on assurances from the Allies.
Yeah.
Not just about troops in Germany, but this broader understanding that NATO wouldn't push east, beyond Germany's new borders.
And it's just wild how much argument there's been over that exact point.
Oh, yeah. Over the years, Western governments have often either just flatly denied it.
Or offered really narrow interpretations.
Exactly. Interpretations that barely touch the spirit of those original talks.
But then those records came out, didn't they? From George Washington University's National Security Archive, 2017-2018.
That was significant.
Yeah.
Those documents, records of talks between American and Allied negotiators, they really back up the Russian claim that verbal assurances were given about no eastward expansion.
So it really shifts the narrative if you look at the actual evidence.
Fundamentally, yes. For anyone willing to look at the primary sources.
And these weren't just like vague hints either. There's stuff suggesting even President Bush Sr. was talking about a big change in European security.
Right, mentioning the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, that included the Soviets.
Suggesting that would be the main framework, maybe implying NATO's role was changing?
His statement certainly hinted at, well, a vision for a new inclusive Europe, where maybe NATO's original job was kind of being superseded.
So what we're seeing is this big gap, isn't it, between the verbal assurances and what was said later publicly.
Which raises huge questions about trust and how these early, let's call them misunderstandings, might have shaped how Russia saw the West for, well, decades.
Yeah, and if you connect that to the bigger picture, you start seeing cracks appearing early on, right? Even as this new inclusive Europe idea was forming.
Like Margaret Thatcher, she was apparently quite against German reunification, told the Irish to cede her concerns.
And the Bush administration had to do some diplomatic footwork.
A bit of maneuvering, yeah, to get NATO support for reunification, kind of working behind the scenes a little.
That's fascinating. Shows that even close allies weren't all on the same page with these huge changes.
And it wasn't just Thatcher. Apparently, the whole U.S. embassy team in Moscow back then united against NATO expansion.
Really? The entire staff?
That's what the sources suggest. Which makes you think about dissenting voices inside the U.S. system, doesn't it?
It does. Did they propose anything else?
Yeah, they had alternative ideas. Different ways to cooperate with the old Warsaw Pact countries. They even floated, like a formal NATO-Russia treaty, to try and head off the problems they saw coming with expansion.
Which makes what Ambassador Burns wrote later even more striking.
Right. As early as '95, he's saying the honeymoon is over, U.S.-Russia relations, that the U.S. couldn't just call the shots anymore.
And what did he say later, reflecting back?
Well, he really stressed the sheer hostility across the Russian political spectrum to even the early talk of NATO expansion. He highlighted this feeling that Russia was weak and that the U.S. was just ignoring their security concerns.
A feeling that just festered, you could say.
Definitely contributed to the tensions building up later.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The Balkans. The sources frame this as a really key moment, almost a testing ground.
A precedent, yeah. That EC decision about self-determination for Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia, that's crucial.
What was the decision exactly?
Basically, the EC said these Serbian populations didn't have the right to self-determination, just minority rights, which effectively stranded hundreds of thousands on the wrong side of new ethnic borders.
And the U.S. Embassy had warned this could happen.
They'd flagged the high chance of conflict coming exactly from this issue, yeah.
And then there's the double standard point. Slovenia and Croatia get recognized quickly.
But not the Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia. Ambassador Zimmerman himself noted this. He apparently thought letting them stay in Yugoslavia was a dangerous doctrine.
Which seems like a stark contrast, doesn't it? Accepting Slovenian and Croatian independence so readily.
Absolutely. That inconsistency definitely fueled resentment, a sense of injustice among Serbs.
And Lord David Owen had a rather cynical take on the EC's motives.
He did.
Mhm.
He suggested it was partly about the EC projecting power, like a virility symbol for the Euro-federalists, showing off its global influence.
Gives you insight into the internal European dynamics, then. The sources also mention a couple of failed agreements, right? Before the final deals.
Yeah, the Zulfikar-Pašić-Karadzic agreement first. That would have kept a union with Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, but Bosnian President Izetbegovic opposed it.
And then the Lisbon deal?
That proposed ethnic cantons within a unified Bosnia. And interestingly, the Bosnian Serbs were apparently okay with it. Even agreed to give up quite a bit of territory they controlled.
That's a detail you don't often hear, the Serbs willing to concede territory then.
But that plan, like the others, ultimately got shot down. The Clinton administration rejected it, even though Russia backed it and some Bosnian reps seemed initially supportive.
So the story of the Bosnian War gets even more complicated when you factor in arms shipments.
Right. Coming from Turkey, Pakistan, funded
Yeah.
largely by Saudi Arabia. And the sources claim this happened with U.S. knowledge, maybe even tacit cooperation.
Drawing a parallel to Afghanistan?
A clear parallel. It suggests a more active U.S. role, maybe, than often admitted. The CIA had worries about Iran's involvement with the Bosnians.
But we're okay once those ties were cut?
Apparently, yes. Now, it's crucial, absolutely crucial, to remember the horrific Serbian atrocities. The sources acknowledge that.
Of course. But this discussion highlights how tangled the origins were, the shared responsibilities.
Exactly. And then the Dayton Accords, while stopping the fighting, really cemented U.S. dominance in Europe. And, as argued in the sources, kind of paved the way for NATO expansion.
Like a proof of concept, almost, for a more assertive U.S. foreign policy.
That's one interpretation presented.
So, after all that complexity in the Balkans and the U.S. role solidified, the stage is really set for NATO expansion proper.
Which brings us right to it. Yeltsin initially was strongly against it. He even brought up those promises made back during German reunification.
What was his argument then?
He pushed for a truly pan-European security system, collective security, not expanding blocs. He warned Clinton about the backlash in Russia, how even moderates would see expansion as, like, a new isolation.
Did he mention Russia joining?
He even raised that possibility, yeah. Russia itself joining NATO eventually.
But then things seemed to shift a bit. Russia's foreign minister hinted they might accept expansion.
If Russia joined first, yeah. It suggests a really complex, maybe evolving Russian view back then. Perhaps wanting inclusion, not exclusion.
But the U.S. direction was clear. Holbrooke pushing expansion over partnership for peace.
Very clear signaling from the U.S. side. Commitment to enlargement.
And this is when people like Kissinger and Brzezinski start raising red flags.
Early warnings, yeah. About the risk of this becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Future confrontation.
Even Kissinger, known as a hawk, urged caution.
He did. Cautioned against making it look like it was aimed at Russia. Echoed old concerns while also acknowledging, potential Russian paranoia.
And Brzezinski worried about Ukraine specifically.
Yeah, about the lack of consensus within Ukraine on joining NATO, predicting it could tear the country apart internally.
But despite these warnings...
Despite the warnings, the first wave happened. 1999. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic joined NATO.
And almost immediately after, we get the Kosovo War.
NATO steps in against Serbia, justified by claims of massacres. Figures that were later seriously questioned.
And the U.S. alignment with the KLA, that's eyebrow-raising.
Definitely. The sources describe the KLA's background as, mixed. Roots in communism, fascism, then links to heroin trade, even bin Ladenite terrorism by the late 90s.
Complicates the simple narrative of just backing democracy, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And then there's that secret part of the Rambouillet Accords, Appendix B.
The one giving NATO free rein in Yugoslavia.
Unrestricted movement, jurisdiction, everywhere. It really looked like a deliberate poison pill, designed so Serbia had to reject it, giving a pretext for war.
Kissinger called it a provocation.
A provocation, yeah. Said no Serb, not even an angelic Serb, could accept it. Called it a terrible diplomatic document.
Even a British minister admitted it was calculated.
Reportedly admitted the NATO occupation clause was designed to be rejected. Raises serious questions about whether Rambouillet was ever a genuine negotiation.
Or if military action was the plan all along.
That's the implication. Now, alongside the military side, there were big economic and energy plays happening too.
Right, the pipelines, like the BTC pipeline.
Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, the U.S. pushed hard for that, specifically to bypass Russia and Iran, described pretty bluntly as sticking it to them.
And the Clinton administration even backed a Taliban pipeline project in Afghanistan.
Seemed willing to tolerate Saudi and Pakistani support for the Taliban, hoping to get that pipeline built. It just shows the complex, sometimes contradictory U.S. goals back then.
And while this is going on, there are internal conflicts within Russia itself, Chechnya.
Yeah, turning to Chechnya, the sources point out links between Chechen separatists and al-Qaeda, training in Afghanistan, funding networks.
That's often missed in the Chechnya discussion.
It is. The sources also question the proof behind blaming Putin for those 1999 apartment bombings, suggesting Chechen terrorists are a plausible alternative explanation.
And the U.S. was involved in regime change efforts elsewhere. Serbia?
Actively, yes.
Yeah.
Funding opposition groups, media aiming to oust Milosevic.
So the argument is Putin's rise was partly a reaction.
A reaction to perceived American overreach after the USSR fell, made worse by these interventions. His FSB appointment, the Second Chechen War, backed by oligarch Berezovsky, are seen in that light.
But early on, Putin actually explored joining NATO.
He did. He apparently asked fundamental questions about NATO's purpose, why it kept expanding towards Russia. He directly questioned Bush about it, shows his early concerns.
And Medvedev later talked about feeling encircled.
By NATO expansion, missile defense systems, yeah, that feeling grew. And Ambassador Burns' 2008 cable, that's really chilling in hindsight.
What did it say?
Warning Washington that the Russian leadership saw NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia as completely unacceptable, an unthinkable situation for them. A classified heads up about how strongly Russia felt.
A clear warning sign.
A very clear one. Then we get into the color revolutions.
Starting with Georgia's Rose Revolution.
U.S. support for opposition figures, NGOs, helping oust Shevardnadze, who was seen as too close to Russia.
And similar patterns in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan.
Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, funding, media support, backing opposition movements. The pattern is laid out in the sources.
And Carl Gershman from the NED actually called the Yanukovych ousting an overthrow.
Admitted it was a successful overthrow. Yes. The argument is these U.S.-backed efforts used local groups and NGOs, kind of masking the outside influence.
Which brings us to Russiagate.
A hugely contested topic. The sources we looked at are blunt. Called it a lie, a political dirty trick to hurt Trump.
What's the reasoning?
Lack of hard proof of Russian interference, the debunked Alpha Bank story. And they highlight that Brennan briefing to Obama in July 2016.
The one saying Russian intelligence knew about the Clinton campaign plan.
Knew the plan was to blame Russia for email leaks, suggesting the Obama team knew early on what the Clinton strategy was.
And the focus on meetings between Trump people and the Russian ambassador.
Presented as routine meetings blown out of proportion. Same with the Trump Tower meeting claims ultimately unsubstantiated.
Damn the media's role.
Accused of downplaying or ignoring info that later undermined the initial Russiagate stories. A biased portrayal, according to these sources.
Okay, let's turn to Ukraine itself, before 2014. Any key background?
Well, Yanukovych signed a shale oil deal with Chevron, potentially hitting Russian energy interests. Plus, Russia was demanding Ukraine pay its overdue gas bill, economic factors swirling around.
And then Maidan.
The Maidan Revolution, portrayed as heavily involving far-right groups, Svoboda, right sector, playing a big role in the protest, the violence.
And there were concerns about Svoboda's ideology.
Yes, fascism, anti-Semitism, ethno-nationalism. These were concerns raised at the time.
And that intercepted phone call about the snipers.
Between EU's Ashton and Estonia's Foreign Minister Payet relaying claims from a Dr. Bogomolets that the same snipers were shooting both protesters and police, raising questions about maybe a third force involved, a new coalition.
Disturbing. The sources also mentioned the Holodomor context.
Yes, the historical famine, and also the rise of racist groups alongside the earlier Orange Revolution, and a tendency to whitewash problematic parts of Ukrainian nationalist history. Sets a complex backdrop for Maidan.
Leading to Azov and the Donbas conflict after 2014.
Right. The integration of militias with Nazi ties, like Azov, into the Ukrainian military. Apparently even praised by the Obama White House, which is contentious.
And releasing Nazi leaders from jail.
Calling them political prisoners? Yes. Adds to the troubling picture. Early reports from Donbas suggested fighters were mainly locals.
Not Russian regulars initially.
Mainly locals using weapons from defecting Ukrainian army units, at least at the start. And Putin didn't annex Donbass right after their referendum then.
Then came Minsk II.
Minsk II agreement, which Kiev then failed to fully implement, leading to years of frozen conflict.
And later admissions that Minsk was just buying time.
Statements from Ukrainian officials admitting it was seen as a tactic, time to rebuild the army, strengthen the anti-Russian coalition.
Looking at U.S. policy and how things escalated, there's that Brookings study
By Ivo Dalder, suggesting the goal was maybe just to inflict more losses on Russia, even if Ukraine couldn't actually win.
and George Soros advising Poroshenko.
Yeah, advising him to imitate Putin's deniability and pursue military options outside the Minsk framework suggests a push to keep the conflict going.
And Obama's 2015 strategy.
Focus more on great power conflict, Russia and China. More sanctions, bigger U.S. military presence in Eastern Europe.
Trump continued arms sales despite talking about better relations.
He did. And those earlier warnings from Burns and Fiona Hill about Ukraine and Georgia in NATO being Russia's brightest of red lines.
And the risk of war.
They look even more significant now. The 2008 Georgia war is presented as a direct result of pushing that line. And the EU later found Georgia's attack on South Ossetia illegal.
And the argument is Russiagate and Ukrainegate just made things worse between the U.S. and Russia.
Further soured an already bad relationship, yes.
Ukrainegate, Hunter Biden, Burisma, the aid questions.
It's all that complexity. Plus Vindman's account of the Trump-Zelensky call, though Zelensky himself played down any quid pro quo.
And Hunter Biden's laptop, initially called Russian disinformation.
By media. Some intel figures, yeah. That letter from 51 ex-intel officials claiming classic earmarks of a Russian op, now seen by many as political, especially since they admitted having no actual proof about the laptop itself.
And the Rand Corporation reports, suggesting strategies to weaken Russia.
By prolonging conflicts, yeah. Syria, Ukraine. Lines up with Defense Secretary Austin saying the goal was to weaken Russia so it couldn't invade again.
And the reports about U.S.-UK training insurgents in Ukraine since 2015.
Disturbing, yes. Training them to kill Russians if an invasion happened. Drawing parallels to Afghanistan again.
But Zelensky was initially open to talks, neutrality.
Early 2022 peace talks. Reports suggest he was open to neutrality, concessions.
But that changed after Ramstein.
Apparently shifted after that meeting.
Yeah.
Promises of more weapons, more war effort.
And the far-right groups, like Azov, are still involved.
Still fighting, despite the Nazi affiliations. Zelensky meeting with Azov leaders raises questions about how much these groups are really being marginalized or denied.
There are even reports of Russian neo-Nazis fighting for Ukraine.
Yes, adding another strange layer to it all.
What about the offensives in 2022-2023?
Planned, delayed, didn't achieve the hoped-for breakthroughs.
Yeah.
The Discord leaks showed U.S. intel was pessimistic about the spring offensive's chances.
And U.S. officials were disappointed Ukraine didn't take more casualties.
Reportedly disappointed, they prioritized limiting losses over trying for bigger gains against Russian defenses, which is quite a perspective.
Then there's the nuclear danger.
Extremely dangerous. Russia suspending New START participation, putting nukes in Belarus. The U.S. deploying mid-range nukes back in Germany for the first time since '87.
And Putin warning of a missile crisis.
Threatening to mirror U.S. deployments. Really heightened tensions.
We're also seeing a stab-in-the-back narrative emerge.
Zelensky still pushing for total victory, despite the battlefield reality. And Arestovich, his former advisor, arguing the West betrayed Ukraine. Promised support they didn't fully deliver, leading to needless deaths in his view.
And the human cost is just immense.
UN figures on civilian deaths, injuries, the millions displaced.
Mm-hmm.
It's staggering.
And now, reports that the U.S. might be backing away from Ukraine in NATO, Blinken telling allies to stop talking about it.
Reports suggest that, yeah, a potential policy shift. The argument is made that a core reason for the war is Biden refusing to negotiate a treaty guaranteeing no NATO for Ukraine.
And failed peace talks late last year. Biden intervened.
Reports suggest U.S. intervention canceled planned talks in late 2023, after which Putin made statements hinting at more territorial goals in Ukraine.
So the consensus now is stalemate. Ukraine can't win militarily.
Growing consensus in U.S. European foreign policy circles, yeah. General Cavoli calling it a stalemate. Best hope, maybe another 2023-style push in 2025.
And a no-fly zone is just too dangerous.
Would almost certainly mean direct U.S.-Russia war. That's the assessment.
Meanwhile, tensions are rising again in the Balkans. Bosnia, Kosovo.
Renewed tensions in Bosnia between the government and Republic of Srpska. Simmering issues, Serbia, Kosovo, old wounds potentially reopening.
And as NATO hits 75, Biden is still warning about Russia attacking others.
Reiterating that threat if Ukraine falls. Even though intel suggests Russia doesn't want a direct NATO conflict, NATO's planning big new brigades.
And the focus is shifting. Now it's about Ukraine and NATO, not just territory.
Seems that way. Acknowledging that pushing Ukraine closer to NATO might actually make Russia expand its war goals, it's a real dilemma.
Wow. This deep dive has really covered a huge, complex history. Shows the interplay of promises, missed chances, shifting interests, all shaping the post-Soviet world.
Yeah, the key takeaways are pretty clear, though. The long shadow of NATO expansion concerns, the impact of U.S. actions in the Balkans and the color revolutions, and these fundamentally different views on how the current conflict started and what its goals are.
So thinking about all this history, it really forces you to consider the long-term impact of current policies, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And to ask, what other paths could have been taken? Maybe more importantly, what paths might still be possible to lower the temperature and find a more stable way forward?
It's a really sobering thought to end on.
Definitely. We really encourage you, the listener, to dig into these sources more, keep exploring, and form your own informed opinions on this incredibly important global situation.